Hello and happy Friday afternoon / evening to my AP Macro peeps. First things first, I want to make sure you can hear me this week because last week you couldn't hear me and I said all these amazing things and then I had to repeat myself and it's never as good the second time. So let me know in the chat if you guys can hear me. Now we wait for the delay, the Vimeo delay, so I know whether or not you guys can hear me. The struggle is real today, my friends. I'm gonna hope and pray that you can hear me. My dogs have joined me now in my teaching space. They are also ready to learn about AP Macro. So let us get started. Today we are going to be covering Unit 5. Unit 5 is the penultimate unit. I love that word, penultimate. I always look for a reason to say it. It means second to the last. It's worth quite a bit of our exam weighting, but I don't want you to stress about that, and I'll explain in a second why I don't want you to stress about that. Okay, so as usual, this stream is being recorded, and it could appear like on the website or YouTube or I don't know, all over the internet, all those good things. If you don't want people to know that you are an econ nerd like me, you might want to change your name. Haha. Okay. Remember that you can connect with Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube. And I finally made myself a real Twitter account the other day. I'm afraid to even delve into it, but we'll see what happens. It might suck my life out of me. Today is our 5th CRAM session. It is April 9th. We'll be meeting again next Friday, April 16th, and then on a weekend day, April 24th, and then on my son's birthday and the NFL draft, April 29th. And then we're going to have the CRAM finale on Mother's Day. I can't wait to spend my Mother's Day with you guys because you're like my econ children. Okay, so I told you, don't stress that this is worth 20 to 30% of your exam score. Why? Because almost every single thing in this unit is something that we already learned about, but just in a little bit more depth. So you're taking concepts that we've covered, and then you are applying them to things. You're going to take those ideas about fiscal policy and monetary policy, and you're actually going to try and solve economic problems. Okay, so there's not too much new information. The only really new stuff here is the Phillips Curve, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Technically, we haven't talked about government deficits and the national debt, but you guys are well-informed citizens, so I'm sure you know that exists. And then crowding out is going to be something that's a little bit new, but not too hard of a concept to understand. But everything else is just taking stuff that we've done before and taking it one step further. So you should not at all worry about that. All right, so as I was saying about stuff that we've covered before, fiscal policy and monetary policy are not new for us. We have talked about these before. We've actually talked about literally everything on this slide before. But now we're going to apply this knowledge. So this slide is more like a review, things that you should have known already. So first of all, fiscal policy is carried out by the government. Monetary policy is carried out by the Federal Reserve Bank. And both of them can affect the economy in the short run. So in the here and now, okay, our economy can be affected by the government through fiscal policy and by the Federal Reserve Bank through monetary policy. There are two types of policy. There's expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, and we practice expansionary fiscal and monetary policy when we are in a recessionary gap. We'll look at some graphs on the next slide, but if you remember when our aggregate demand and our short-run aggregate supply came together at equilibrium before the long run, that was a recessionary gap. If you're looking at the business cycle, our recessionary gap is when we're down in the trough, okay? And if you think about the business cycle, that area from the trough up to the peak is an area of expansion. And that's why this is called expansionary policy. This is what we're doing, trying to expand our economy to fix things. On the flip side, you have contractionary fiscal and monetary policy. This is when our short-run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand curve come to an equilibrium beyond or to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve. This is an inflationary gap. This is when we're at the top of the business cycle and we need to contract the economy to slow it down a little bit. All of these policies can influence aggregate demand. They can influence real output, which is also called GDP. It can influence the price level, and they can also influence the interest rates. So now we're going to look at some spiffy graphs to take this a step further, but that should have all been review. Cross our fingers, that was all review. And this is review 2. So first of all, remember that when we're in aggregate disequilibrium, that means our aggregate curves are not making that really cool star when they all come together. On the left, you have the recessionary gap, as I mentioned, when aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply come into equilibrium before the long run, to the left of the long run. However, if our economy is doing too much too fast, that puts us in an inflationary gap. And that's when those two lines, AD and SRAS, come together to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve. You need to be like super duper familiar with these graphs. They love these graphs. The College Board loves them. I can almost guarantee that one of your free response questions will either start with one of these graphs or give you the scenario and ask you to draw one of these graphs. So make sure that you are 150,000% familiar with what these look like, including, very important, including the way the axes are labeled. Okay, that is worth a lot of points on the AP exam, and that is a place where a lot of students struggle, which is sad because it's so simple. Okay, so make sure you know how to label them and what they mean. Okay, more graphs, because what would econ be without graphs? It would just be sad. Okay, so on the left-hand side, it's the graph you just looked at when we were in a recessionary gap because our AD and our SRAS curves come together to the left of the LRAS. Because we are in a recessionary gap, we need some expansionary policy. And what we're looking at here is expansionary fiscal policy. Because when the government practices expansionary fiscal policy, they're going to directly affect aggregate demand. Because if you recall, there are two types of policy that the federal government can enact. They can change the tax rate and they can change government spending. Both of those things will affect aggregate demand. If they lower taxes, then consumers have more discretionary income and they will spend more, which is part of the consumer spending, C plus G plus I plus NX, of the aggregate demand curve. On the other hand, if they increase government spending, they're directly influencing the G in the C plus G plus I plus NX. Either way, it's going to increase aggregate demand. When we increase or we go up, we move to the right. I go over this with my students like 5,000 times from the beginning of the semester. Up and to the right, down and to the left. When things go up or they increase, we always move our graph to the right. If things go down or decrease, we always move our graph to the left. That is probably the most basic but most important piece of knowledge you can have for the AP exam. Up and to the right, down and to the left when we're moving our graphs. So this is the government. But what happens if the Fed practices monetary policy? Then what will happen? Now we have three graphs. Because the things that the Fed does, their monetary policy does not directly affect our aggregate demand. It first affects the money supply, and that affects our aggregate demand. So let's look at this. We already know the first graph. We already know the third graph. So let's take an extra special look at that graph in the middle. That graph in the middle is what happens when there's expansionary monetary policy. If we remember, there are 3 ways the Federal Reserve Bank can affect our economy. The first one is by setting the discount rate. The second one is by setting the reserve requirement. And the third one is by practicing open market operations, which is the buying and or selling of bonds, which are also called securities. So in order to practice expansionary monetary policy, the Federal Reserve Bank would want to lower the interest rate, the discount rate, or lower the reserve requirement, or buy bonds on the open market. All of those things would cause the money supply to increase. Increases up. When we go up, we move to the right. So notice our money supply curve there moves to the right. When our money supply curve moves to the right, our interest rate goes down because now we have a new equilibrium point. And the interest rate falling is the key to aggregate demand increasing over in the third graph. Because if my interest rate goes down, then people are more apt to spend money using credit. Consumers are more likely to buy things, businesses are more likely to buy things, and the government is more likely to buy things. That's the C, the G, and the I. So all of those things could increase, which would increase our aggregate demand or make it go up, and then it would move to the right in the graph. Okay, so that's what it looks like if the Fed does it. Same end point, but a little bit different in the middle than the fiscal policy. Okay, here's a really spiffy chart. Isn't it wonderful? It shows us all those things I just said, but it does a recessionary gap and an inflationary gap. So the thing is, with the inflationary gap, everything is going to be the opposite of what I just said. Okay, it shows what happens here with fiscal policy. This chart also shows you monetary policy. And this chart adds something. No policy. What if nobody does anything? This is what we call self-correcting. Will the economy self-correct? In theory, yes. Why does the government intervene? Why does the Fed intervene? In hopes that they can fix it faster, or that they can fix it without it having such a drastic effect on all of us. But self-correcting is a thing, so you should understand that last one there. If we have no policy and we are in a recessionary gap, so recession is like people don't have jobs and things like that, that means there are a lot of unemployed people. If there are a lot of unemployed people, that means businesses can pay their workers less money because there are so many workers fighting for one position. When this happens, supply can actually increase because the cost of labor is an input into supply. So that will make our short-run aggregate supply increase, and that will take us out of our recessionary gap. On the flip side, if we're in an inflationary gap, that means that wages are probably pretty high. Okay. And they're so high because everybody's employed at this point. So if you want somebody to come work for you, you have to kind of entice them to come over there. Well, what better way to entice somebody to come work at your business than by paying them more money than they're making wherever they were working? So as the wages go up, again, wages are an input in supply. That's going to make our SRAS curve go down and to the left, decrease. And that will bring us also back to equilibrium. So we are going to take a stab at a practice question, I think. Yes, we are. Practice question number 1. Let's go over here to our polls and open our poll. Okay, Fiveable is experiencing a recessionary gap. Uh-oh. Which of these combinations of monetary and fiscal policy will help to close that gap? All right, so when you answer a question like this, the College Board likes questions like these, you need to make sure that both of the things are going to do what you want. So you can't just read part of the answer because that's where they get you here. So both of the things in the answer have to get us out of our recessionary gap. And if you remember the way to get out of a recessionary gap is to practice expansionary policy. Okay, so which of these things would be an expansionary piece of fiscal policy plus an expansionary piece of monetary policy? And I am liking the answers in the poll because, of course, the answer is A. We want to decrease taxes and buy bonds on the open market. Both of those things are going to get us to a place where we can get out of our recessionary gap. Okay. So at the bottom of the chart, we talked about the long run self-adjustment, and I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to see what it looked like graphically. So this is actually an economy that's in equilibrium. It's doing well. And in equilibrium, what happens is first, I got really mad at this example when I used it with my class and then I didn't change it, but I'm going to save it right now as I stare at it. Okay, so this economy is already in equilibrium. Then they move out of equilibrium. They're operating at a point beyond long-run equilibrium. You see in the second graph where AD and SRAS come together to the right of LRAS. That means now we're in an inflationary gap. Yes? Self-correcting, well, inflationary gap means wages are too high, which means supply is going to be affected. Supply is going to go down or decrease. SRAS is going to go down and to the left. And we will come back to an equilibrium point, but notice that that equilibrium point is now at a higher price level than it was before. Okay, so back in equilibrium, but at a different price level. Okay, moving on to the new thing, dun, 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 the Phillips curve. It's like a bad word among AP teachers. No, I'm just kidding. It's another graph. Oh, another graph that you need to know, but does it look familiar? It should look familiar. Kind of looks like a demand curve, no? But it's not, but it looks like one. So pay very close attention to the way it is labeled. Our y-axis shows the inflation rate. Our x-axis shows the unemployment rate. And that is because the Phillips curve is a theoretical model used to understand the relationship between, shockingly, the two things that are on the axes, the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So you might be wondering, what kind of relationship do inflation and unemployment have? Well, the reality is, in the short run, you kind of have to choose between the two. You can either have really low unemployment and inflation, or you can have higher unemployment and no inflation. That's a tough choice, really. It really is. But it is the reality. So our curve is downward sloping because the higher the unemployment rate is, the lower the inflation rate, as we can see on the graph in front of us. The economy is always going to operate somewhere along this, okay? The SRPC, short run Phillips curve. Now, just like our demand and supply curves, you can move along this or you can shift the whole thing. If you move along the short run Phillips curve, that means there has been a demand shock. We will look at that in a second. If the entire Phillips curve shifts, that means there has been a supply shock. And we will also look at that in a second. All right, Phillips curve, you definitely need to know it. Definitely going to ask you about it on the AP exam. There will definitely be some multiple choice questions. There could be a free response question that is either all about the Phillips curve or references the Phillips curve in at least one part. So you need to be aware of it. So as I said, when there's a demand shock, you move along the curve. So a demand shock is an unanticipated increase in aggregate demand as evidenced by the first graph. Yes. So here in this graph, we have aggregate demand is actually going down, okay? So the demand shock can make it go up, it can make it go down, but either thing that happens is unanticipated. So our aggregate demand has moved down and to the left. It has moved from point A to point B in that first graph. When that happened, we moved along the SRPC. Our inflation rate went down because people aren't spending as much, but our unemployment went up also because people aren't spending as much. Okay, so this is the trade-off between the two. Okay, so that is a demand shock that moves us along the short run Phillips curve. But we can also have a supply shock. That's when there's a big change in supply. Supply can go up, it can go down. In the graph we have here, our supply is increasing because it is moving to the right. And when our supply increases, it is going to cause the entire short runs Phillips curve to move. Okay, as evidenced by the graph in front of us. That means it changes at every level when the whole curve moves. Every level is changing. Okay. Here is the long run Phillips curve, because you couldn't just have a short run Phillips curve without a long run Phillips curve. And this shows the long run relationship between inflation and unemployment. And you'll notice that this curve is vertical. What does that mean? Well, that's the natural rate of unemployment. So if you remember a few units ago, we talked about the different types of unemployment. And I mentioned that frictional unemployment and structural unemployment are kind of normal. They're just things that happen. There's always somebody that's unemployed. It's natural. So at the natural rate of unemployment, we are at that line of the long run Phillips curve. In the United States, they say 4 to 5% is natural unemployment. When we go above that, it's because of cyclical unemployment. And cyclical unemployment is unemployment connected to the business cycle. So when our cyclical unemployment is high, that will make our unemployment rate above the natural rate of unemployment. And if our cyclical unemployment rate is very low, that will bring us below the natural rate of unemployment. But you will see that the LRPC is right there along that rate. It can shift based on the same factors that would cause the natural rate of unemployment to change. It doesn't really change very often, though, and that's about all you need to know about the long run Phillips curves. You just got to remember that it's vertical. Okay, and that it shows a long run relationship, which shouldn't be too hard to remember because it's called the long run Phillips curve. Equilibrium in our Phillips curve is where our short run Phillips curve and our long run Phillips curve come together. Notice they come together at point C. Any points to the left of the long run show inflationary gaps. Okay, that's point A. We have high inflation there, right? Because an inflationary gap is when we're producing more than we should be, more than normal, which means our unemployment is super low, but our inflation is high, which is why we would enact some kind of contractionary policy to bring us down to earth. Yes, so our inflation rate doesn't go cray-cray. On the other hand, point B, or any points to the right of the long run, will show a recessionary gap. Yikes, look at that unemployment rate, 8%. That used to sound like really terrible to me. And then we had COVID and our unemployment rate was way higher than 8%. But 8% is pretty bad in normal times, okay? And that shows we are in a recession. Inflation is very low, which is nice if you have a job. But if you're one of the 8% of people that are unemployed, it's not such a happy place to be. Okay, so that's what you need to know about the Phillips curve. Our friend, the Phillips curve. Okay, practice question number 2. Let us open up the poll. You guys notice that sometimes I like to sing when I talk? The most interesting thing about doing this is that I'm literally talking to myself. I know you guys are listening, but I can't see you or hear you or anything, so it's pretty interesting. Okay. A decrease in the expected inflation rate will cause which of the following? Okay, inflation is going to go down. What does that mean? what is going to happen here? Sometimes when I talk to you guys, I feel like Adrienne from Yoga with Adrienne. I don't know if you guys ever practice yoga for self-care, but she records those videos and then she finds herself singing silly things to herself. There are worse people I could compare myself to than Adrienne, but that's how I feel right now. This is a tough question because we just talked about the Phillips curve, but I want you to remember that the Phillips curve is drawn for a given inflation rate, an expected inflation rate. So it will shift if inflationary expectations change. Okay, so they're expecting inflation to do one thing. If it does something else, it's going to shift. So if we have a decrease in the expected inflation rate, that's going to shift our short run Phillips curve to the, drum roll please, to the left. Okay, it's going to shift it to the left. And yeah, this is the kind of question you might see on the test relating to the Phillips curve. All right, let's see. We're going to click that, and then we're going to go back here. Okay, money growth and inflation. Okay, we're back to things that we know about. We've heard about before. We talked about inflation. But don't forget that inflation is when the money supply grows too fast for a sustained period of time that makes things appear to cost more or your money appear to be worth less. We are very used to inflation. It happens on the regular. On the flip side, we have deflation, which does not happen on the regular, but you still need to know what it is. And that's when the money supply shrinks too fast, which makes prices appear to go down or your money appear to be worth more than it was. Not something you see very often. Okay, this next thing that's in italics is super, super important. At full employment, that means long run equilibrium. Okay, a change in the money supply will not affect real output. How important is that? Well, I was looking at the progress check questions that perhaps your AP teachers use, and there's literally a question that was like, at full employment, what will happen to real output in the long run? And you know what the answer is? Nothing. Nothing will happen because at full employment, a change in the money supply will have no effect on the real output. So memorize that little tidbit there just in case you find it in one of your multiple choice questions. Okay, so that's not necessarily new information, but now we're going to talk about the quantity theory of money, which I'm going to be totally honest with you. Like the first time I learned about this, it was like, I don't know, seemed kind of scary because not because of the equation. The equation is not very hard. M times V equals P times Y. Okay, I get that. But then I learned what the variables meant. I was okay with the M for money supply, the P for price level, Y, real GDP. Okay, nothing scary. And then it was like V, velocity. I was like, when did I transport into this science class? Because I don't science. That's what I tell my students. I can math, I can history, I can English, but the science gets me. So the V really scared me. Don't be scared by the V, the velocity of money. What the heck is the velocity of money? It's how many times a dollar changes hands. Really not as scary as it could be. So here's our formula. Money times velocity equals price times real GDP. Do I need to memorize this formula, Maria? Yes. Yes, you do. You also need to, I like to say, rememberize that there are 4 variables there, and they will often give you 3 and ask you to solve for the 4th, which means you need to remember like just a tiny bit of algebra, which shouldn't be too scary for most of you guys. Because you might have to change where things are in the formula. And we are going to do a practice question right now that is going to involve us doing just that, okay? And I don't want you to freak out when you see the practice question because we're like definitely going to walk through it and talk through it together. But first, I'm going to open the poll and then I'm going to show you the question. And here we go. Are we ready? Okay, so if the nominal GDP is 50 million, the price level is 1.25, and the central bank has set the money supply at $10 million. What is the real GDP and the velocity of money according to the quantity theory of money? So first I'm going to ask, are any of you freaking out right now? This question's a little freaky. Don't freak out. I'm right here with you, you guys. Don't freak out. So we got to figure out the real GDP. Okay. So how are we going to figure out the real GDP? We are going to take our nominal GDP. This is, by the way, review. Finding real GDP is something we've covered before. We're going to take our nominal GDP, which is 50 million, and we are going to divide it by the price level. So we're going to take 50 million and we're going to divide it by 1.25. I am confident that all of you can do that math, okay? So 50 million divided by 1.25, which is going to give us 40 million. So that's our real GDP. So now we know our answer is either A or D. We're halfway there. But now we have to figure out the velocity. Oh no, that scary science word, velocity, the velocity of money. Okay, how are we going to do that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. We are going to take our nominal GDP, $50 million, and we're going to divide it by our money supply, $10 million. And what is 50 divided by 10? Very, very, very difficult math here. 50 divided by 10 is 5. So our real GDP is $40 million, and our velocity of money is 5. So our answer to this question is D. If you are freaking out right now and like, oh my gosh, my brain can't handle this, I would say it is unlikely that you find more than one multiple choice question like this on the AP exam. And that if you found this somewhere in a free response question, it would probably only be worth 1 point because it would be like a sub part, like part E or something of a question. So if this is really mind-blowing to you, don't stress out. It's okay. You can still get a 5 on the AP exam and not understand this concept. Okay? I was just talking to my AP World students about giving yourself grace, allowing yourself to not be perfect. And I know that is difficult for many of us, especially those of us that would take AP exams, especially those of us who would go the extra mile and sign up for Fiveable CRAMs to prepare for those AP exams. So let me just tell you right now, from somebody that has tried to be perfect for 38 years, you cannot be perfect all the time. There are moments in life when things are perfect, right? Maybe you get a perfect score on an exam or whatever. But overall in life, you can't be perfect at everything all the time. So if this is the thing that you have to let go, like the econ concept that you can't grasp, I know it's hard for my students, then let it go and be okay with that, because you could still get a 5, which is a perfect score without a perfect score. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll get off my little soapbox now about not feeling like you have to be perfect. That goes for every part of your life, by the way. Don't be down on yourself if you don't think you're perfect, because none of us are. That's the great thing about humanity. Okay. So we're going to go over a few words that you probably have heard before. Nothing new here. Chances are you took a government class. Maybe you're taking one right now. Maybe it was even AP Gov. Okay, so the things we're talking about here are things that cross over with government, okay, because we're talking about what the government's doing with their budgets and things like that. So revenue is all of the income that the government brings in. Where do they get that income from? 50,000 different types of taxes, like income taxes, excise taxes, this taxes, that taxes, right? All those things. That is where government revenue comes from. Okay, that's the money they bring in. The expenditures, expend. It's the things that they spend money on, all right? So expenditures is all the money that the government spends. Well, what the heck does the government spend money on? Mostly, if you remember from Gov, Social Security is the number one thing. And then national defense is the number two thing. And like somewhere near the bottom is education, which I think is wrong, but that's a whole other story altogether. So those are all the things we spend, okay? If the government is practicing fiscal stimulus, a very popular word right now, stimulus, then they're using expansionary policy because they're trying to stimulate the economy or make it grow. Okay. Sometimes they use fiscal restraint. That's when they're holding things back, which is like contractionary policy. And that's when they're trying to slow the economy down. Okay. So just a few pieces of vocabulary that you need to know. All right. Yikes. Deficits and the national debt. I hate to break it to you guys, but our government is in debt. I'm sure that you already knew that. We've basically been in debt for, I don't know, I can just hear my dog snoring. We've been in debt for as long as my dog's been snoring. No, for like a long time. What does that mean? That means that our government spends more money than they make, which shouldn't be too shocking because a lot of Americans do the same thing. Okay, so, however, it's really important to understand the difference between a deficit and the national debt. So, let's go to a promised place, a place where there is a surplus, a budget surplus. That means there's extra money. That means there's more revenue than there are expenditures. Not very common for the federal government, but nonetheless, a thing you need to understand. So, they call that being in the black, by the way. When you're in the black, that means you are bringing in more money than you are spending. On the other hand, there's the budget deficit. And that is when you are spending more money than you are bringing in. That is called being in the red. We don't want to be in the red, but we often are. Now, here is the kicker. You can be in the black and still have a debt, a national debt. The government can have a surplus 1 year or at least break even, yes, but still have national debt. That is the same way that I can make a certain amount of money this month and not spend it all, but still be in debt. Well, as an individual, my debt probably comes from, I don't know, credit cards. So I could have not put any money on my credit cards this month, but still have credit card debt. So you'll hear the government talk about, oh, we have a budget surplus or we're breaking even. We're not having a deficit this year. That does not mean the national debt has gone away. It just means that this year we're not adding to it. Except that like we're always adding to the national debt because when you owe somebody money, they charge you interest. Dun, dun, dun. Oh, interest is a scary thing, which means we have to pay back more than we borrowed. So that means our national debt could be increasing even if we are paying on it. And as we are paying our debt, that is money that we cannot use for other things. I'm going to give you like an individual example as opposed to the government. So I want you to think about this like you're yourself. So let's say you went and ran up $10,000 on your credit card. Not bright, but let's say you did that. And now you have to pay it back. And you have to pay it back like $500 a month until it's paid off. Well, when you send that $500 to your credit card company for something that you bought like months and months ago, it means you cannot use that $500 now for something else. The government is in the same situation. Why is there not enough funding for healthcare? Why is there not enough funding for education? Why is there not enough funding for the military? Why is et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Because we are spending a tremendous amount of our budget on paying back debt. Okay? And I want you to remember that for like your real life if you get nothing else out of like high school and Fiveable and AP Economics. I want you to remember that when you make those financial decisions to put yourself into debt, you're getting something now, but you're going to pay for it for a long time, and it's going to keep you from being able to do other things. Okay, I'm super soapboxy today. I don't know why that is, but life lessons from me. Do as I say, not as I do. Okay, practice question number 4. Let's open up the poll for this. Okay, which of these shows a deficit in the government budget? So which one of those things mean that there is a deficit? Is it consumption spending exceeding private savings? Is it government purchases and transfer payments exceeding tax revenues? Is it government purchases and transfer payments exceeding the national debt? Or is it consumption spending exceeding the national debt? So which one of those things is a government budget deficit? Let's see if we can figure it out together. I wonder if you guys can hear my dog snoring. He's very loud and it amuses me very much. Okay. Let's see where we are with our answers here. Remember that the deficit has to do with the government spending money, and it does not have to do with us spending money. So maybe that will help you out. And yes, the answer is B. Government purchases and transfer payments exceed tax revenues. The government is spending more money than they're bringing in. And that's what brings us into a deficit. Very nice. You should do your best in your life as you grow up and become adults to never run a budget deficit. Sometimes it's impossible, especially with college, but if you can manage to keep yourself like that, you will live a very financially fruitful life. I promise. Okay. This is another new-ish thing. Not new-ish, it is new. This is another one of the very few new things in this unit. Crowding out. Okay. So crowding out occurs when the interest rate drops, yeah, and then the government's like, "Oh, I'm going to spend more money." And they spend so much money and borrow so much money that there's like no money left for any of us. And by us, I mean private individuals. Okay, so let's look at the graphs. Oh, look, a recessionary gap. We've never seen that before, with our aggregate demand and our short run aggregate supply coming together to the left of the long run aggregate supply. Yikes, recessionary gap. Government goes, oh no, we must enact some kind of fiscal policy. So the government goes and spends a whole bunch of money. Only, if you recall, the government doesn't have any money. So where do they get all the money that they spend? Well, they're going to have to borrow it. And when they borrow that money, that means there's less money for us to borrow. And when there's less money for us to borrow, the interest rate is going to go up because the less money available, the higher the interest they can charge. Then we don't even want to borrow the money anymore. And that is going to cause aggregate demand to shift down and to the left. So if you look at our graphs, graph 1 is our recessionary gap. Graph 2, it's hard to say graph and gap. Okay, graph 2 is the fiscal stimulus policy enacted. Look at that aggregate demand move. Yay! But what does that do to the interest rate? It makes interest rate go up. Higher interest rates make aggregate demand go down. So you'll notice in the third graph, we have that AD2 curve in between aggregate demand and aggregate demand 1. And that is a graphical example of crowding out. The government has crowded us out from being able to borrow money. Not just us as consumers, but businesses as well. Okay, so this is what crowding out is. And I think we're going to answer a question. I'm so far ahead today, you guys. I hope you saved up some questions for me and you can start putting them in the chat so that they're ready to go when we are ahead. Okay, practice question number 5. Let's open our poll. This one's a no-brainer because we just talked about it. Which of these terms describes the unfavorable effect that occurs when private sector investment spending competes with government deficit financing? What is it called when that happens? Oh, good. We have a correct answer. That makes me happy. That means you guys were listening to me and that you heard that it's called crowding out, the crowding out effect. Very nice. So there we go. We will publish those results. And I'm hoping that I get some really spiffy econ questions in the chat. They do not have to be about this unit, by the way. Whatever floats your boat, because we're definitely going to finish before 5 o'clock /8 o'clock /7 o'clock, depending on where you live. Okay, economic growth Yay, economic growth is great. That means that our real GDP per capita, right, per person per head is growing over time. Yay, economic growth. Okay, so what do we need to know here? Aggregate employment, which is all the employment together, and aggregate output, which is essentially everything we're producing, are directly related. If businesses are going to increase production, they're going to need to hire more people. Shocking, right? So, more production, more employees, higher output, higher employment, aggregate output up, aggregate employment up. Okay? Here's where you get the aggregate production function. And I absolutely love saying production function because it reminds me of the conjunction junction, but that's a whole other story. So the aggregate production function tells us that as the output per person is directly related to the physical capital per person and the human capital per person. Okay, Maria, what does that mean? Output per person. How much are we producing per person? Physical capital. Remember, capital are things that we use to make other things. It could be like machinery or tools or bulldozers, warehouses, economics textbooks, which are used to make many economists. All those things are physical capital. Okay, so our output that we make per person is directly related to our physical capital per person. And also our human capital. We remember our human capital is our abilities as a person, our labor, our skills, all those things we learn in school. So the more skills we have and the more physical capital have, the more output we can create. It seems pretty logical. We also look at the average labor productivity, which is when we take our output and we divide it per worker instead of per capita. So per capita is per head, that's like the population. But output per worker is like, okay, I have 10 workers and I made 100 things. So my average labor productivity is 10 things per worker. For economic growth, we can show economic growth by either moving our LRAS to the right, because remember, growth is up is always to the right. Or we can shift our PPC. So like take ourselves back, way, way back to our very first unit when we learned about the production possibilities curve. And we learned that if it shifted out and to the right, that meant that there was an increase, right? We have economic growth. So both of those things show economic growth. If our LRAS moves to the right or our PPC moves to the right. And the same token, if our LRAS moved to the left or our PPC shifted inward down and to the left, that would mean that we have economic non-growth. The opposite of growth. That doesn't really happen very often, but just thought would bring that to your attention. Okay. So what are the things that can make our economy grow? There are three big things that can make our economy grow. The first one is advancements in technology. We can produce so much more when our technology allows us to do so. Being able to make things with machinery instead of by hand would be the very first example of when this happened. So flashback to AP World History when you learned about the Industrial Revolution and you learned about like the spinning wheel and the water loom and then the steam engine and all those things. And now people didn't have to make everything by hand. They could use these machines to help. And when they use those machines to help, they're able to make more, okay? Even today, technology is increasing tremendously. My husband and I were just discussing like the technology that was available when we were your age. Now I sound like an old person. Back when I was your age, 20 whole years ago, the amount of technology we had available to us compared to the technology we have today. Just look at your cell phone, yeah? The cell phone I had when I was your age was a Nokia. I spent a lot of money on it, but it could not do any of the things my phone can do now, except for make phone calls. You didn't really text back then. I could make phone calls. There was a primitive calculator on there, and I could play Snake. It was super exciting. And that phone didn't cost that much less than the phone I have in my hand right now. The phone I have in my hand right now is essentially a computer. I can do, it's not comfortable, but I could do all of my work from my phone. I could have made all of those slides on my phone. It would have been very annoying, but it would have been possible. Okay, so these technological advancements can speed up and improve production tremendously. And we have seen that happen throughout the world. Okay, physical capital. The more physical capital we have, the more production we can have. If we are able to have more factories, then we can produce more things. Aside for, we're not going to worry about like the environmental implications because we're going to pretend that our factories are all run on clean energy and they all follow all the environmental rules. But the more factories we can have, the more things we can produce. And the more workers we have, the more things we can produce. But human capital is more than just how many workers we have. And this is where I'm going to stand on my soapbox for the final time tonight. And I'm going to talk about the fact that if we could improve education in our country, we would actually be increasing our human capital and eventually bring us to a place where we could have higher productivity. So next time you get into an argument with somebody about why we should invest in education, you can remind them that an investment in education is an investment in human capital, and that investment in human capital will bring us higher productivity down the line. Okay, so it's not just about more workers, it's about what our workers can do. Okay, and it doesn't have to be like, oh, I can do calculus, or I can do AP Economics, even though AP Economics is great, but it could be teaching them a skill like being an electrician or working with wood or being an airplane mechanic or any kind of skill that they can have that they didn't have before. And the more skills we have and the knowledge we have and the more things we're able to do, the higher our productivity will be. So these are the three things that can give us some economic growth. Okay, public policy and economic growth, because I just talked about why the government should spend more money on education. Well, that right there is public policy. And if you happen to also be taking AP Gov, here is another place where our two classes coincide. So public policy, that would be policies that the government enacts, can affect our real GDP and they can affect our economic growth. So how can we do that? Well, we can increase productivity and labor force participation by ding, 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 spending money on education. Okay, I didn't just come up with that one, by the way, on my own. The College Board agrees with me on that one. We can also invest in technology. How can the government do that? Well, they did that starting way back in the day in the Industrial Revolution by protecting intellectual property. You guys know what a patent is, patents and copyrights. So by the government protecting our ideas, it encourages more people to research and come up with ideas. The government can also promote creativity, finding creative ways to solve our problems. All of those are investments in technology, and all of those investments in technology will bring us some good old economic growth. We can also improve our infrastructure. And by improving infrastructure, we can move our goods better. And that's the biggest thing. So like new ways of transporting or ways to transport go way, way back in time to the construction of the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. And think about how that revolutionized the movement of goods in this world and how that led to economic growth. Okay, but infrastructure could also be like, it could be building railroads or bridges, dams, canals, all those kind of things. Okay, there's also supply side fiscal policies, and that is when we influence the supply of things. And how can we influence the supply of things? Well, through incentives. What's an incentive? An incentive is something that makes us want to do something. And what kind of incentives does the government offer? Subsidies and tax breaks. They will encourage you to do something by offering you a subsidy. They will encourage you to produce more of something by offering you a tax break. That is attacking it from the supply side. So those are supply side fiscal policies, as opposed to all the fiscal policies we talked about before, which are aggregate demand based. Okay, I have a question about the decision to invest. do the real profits have to be greater than the interest? Are you talking about investing money? Like, we're talking about investing cash? We'll see. I know that when you guys watch the replay, you won't be able to read the chat, which is why I read that question out loud. So they're going to let me know if they're talking about investing cash, and then I will formulate an answer to that question, which is good because that question was timed perfectly because that was absolutely the end of our slideshow. A reminder that you can connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and that Rupi's going to lead an amazing conversation over in Discord. And now we will go back. Oh, the government investing. Okay, so if the government invests, okay, so I'm going to say like the government doesn't really invest unless you're talking about investing. So they don't invest money, but they invest. Let me see how to word this. They don't invest money the way we do, right? They're not putting their money in the stock market. They invest in education, technology, things like that in hopes to grow our economy. If a firm is going to invest, that's a new question. If a firm invests, do the real profits have to be greater than the interest? Do the real profits have to be greater than the interest? Well, I guess you're talking about like a fixed rate investment. I'm trying to see where you're going with this question. Perhaps you can explain it a little bit more in the chat. While I answer this next question, is crowding in important here? And could you please go over crowding out effect again? I can go over the crowding out effect again. Crowding out is really important. You should definitely know that. Beep, 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 moving backwards. Beep, 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 beep. Oh, too far. Crowding out. Okay. So imagine the interest rate has dropped immensely and the government is like, ooh. And also the government notices that we're in a recessionary gap and they're like, oh, what are we going to do about that? So they decide that what they're going to do about it is to increase government spending. You could actually kind of see this happening a little bit right now. So the government's like, oh, we're going to spend all this money. We got all those stimulus payments, right? And they did not have that money, the $1.9 trillion or whatever that was just approved. The government doesn't have $1.9 trillion. So they're going to have to borrow $1.9 trillion. And in order to borrow that $1.9 trillion, well, not in order to borrow it, but when they borrow that money, that is now money that the private sector, so that would be firms and individuals, they can no longer borrow that money because the government already did. So now there's less money available for all of the rest of us to borrow. Because there's less money available, the supply of loanable funds, if you remember the loanable funds market from last week, the supply of loanable funds has gone down and to the left. Okay, that makes our interest rate go up. And when the interest rate is higher, then we don't want to spend the money as individuals. We're like, yikes, maybe I'm not going to buy that new car at 10% interest. And a business is like, oh, I wanted a new machine, but I don't want to pay 12% interest on it. So we make the decision not to spend extra money, which is going to cause our aggregate demand to come down into the left as shown in the third graph. So that's basically crowding out, and like a very simple sentence is the government borrowed all the money and there's none left for the rest of us. Or the money that's left is too expensive for us to borrow, which would cause our spending as consumers and businesses to go down. All right, so I had so much fun with you guys tonight. And I can't believe I finished before 5. It is a modern day miracle, but it makes up for the fact that we definitely went over on Sunday. I will see you guys next Friday, where we're going to do the very last unit, all about foreign economies and their interaction with our economy and foreign exchange and all that good stuff. As always, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you guys. You can always reach out to me in the Discord, reach out to Rupi. We're always here to help you. We enjoy you so much. I hope you all have a very fantastic weekend, and I will see you guys next Friday.